came across something interesting looking at some of my own lifts from my workout yesterday, and I just thought I would share it publicly because I just thought there was a few things I could highlight. I learned a thing or two new myself that I assumed differently than what it actually is, and I just thought this was an interesting thing to highlight. So, one of the things a lot of people know about the starting strength program, the kind of classic linear progression, is that the as assigned version has power cleans. And a lot of people don't do the power cleans for various reasons, and they substitute the barbell row. So what I thought I would do here is contrast an almost perfectly lined up timing wise power clean on the left with a barbell row on the right, just to point out some differences between the two, some similarities between the two, just to do a basic compare and contrast in my own lifts. Now, I should preface this by saying I'm not suggesting here that my own lifts are a perfect model of technical perfection for this, especially for the power clean. They're not. I have been power cleaning about once a week regularly for the last month or two, but prior to that, I had not power cleaned regularly for a while, so I'm still a little rusty on those, and they were probably never perfect even to begin with when I was less rusty on them. So I'm not suggesting that this is a perfect model of a perfectly executed lift. It's not, but it's close enough. It's decent for comparison purposes for what we're doing here. So as you can see on the screen, I think I'm at the very beginning of the lift. One thing I noticed right away is that my starting position was basically the same. Now, there are some very minor differences that I think can mostly be attributed down to the fact that I changed my shoes. So here I'm lifting in a, approximately 3/4 inch heel with a Nike Romaleos, whereas here I had changed to the flat soled Noble trainers. So there's a slight difference there in terms of, my knee angle and hip elevation. And also, I'm taking a slightly wider grip in the rows. Now, you notice the distance, for whatever reason, the way it set this up had me closer here than here, so it's obviously not to perfect scale. Again, I think for our purposes of comparison here, that's not important. We can see what we need to see, even despite that imperfection. But you see my starting position is basically the same in both. Now, of course, there are a lot of people who would say that you should start your cleans at a lower hip position. That's a totally different discussion for a different time. But just for the purposes here of what I actually do and what I actually did on this rep, you can see that the starting position is essentially the same, aside from the differences of the change in shoes. I turn my toes out a little more on the rows, but essentially the same, and also a slightly wider grip. But besides that, my start position is basically the same. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to play the video through to watch it through. It's 5 reps on the rows and 3 reps on the cleans. I'll play it through, and then what I'll do after that is go back and play through the first rep, which are matched almost perfectly coordinated timing wise, so they happen at the same time, they start at the same time, and we can compare and contrast some of the differences. So let's watch through the whole video here. Okay, and to clarify, that's 245 for a triple on the cleans, and you can't see the plates here, but this is 315 on the deadlift. So there is a fairly big weight difference, but not a massive weight difference between the two. For reference, my best deadlift is 700 pounds, although I could not do 700 pounds right now, but I do plan to do that or more than that by the end of the year. So right now I don't know what my actual max is, but I've done 700 pounds in the not too distant past. So both of these are very light relative to my deadlift. Okay, so we pointed out the starting position is the same. Let's look at the initial pull. So let's focus on, kind of watch both, and we'll go through kind of frame by frame here. The initial pull, a little bit slowed down, and that's the whole first rep. Okay, so let's go back to the beginning. Let's note here, in the initial pull, is also basically identical, just like the first, like the starting position, like the setup is basically identical. What you notice is that my arms start to bend earlier in the row. But if you notice the first few inches, about here to this point, you notice the pull is basically identical aside from the speed at which it's being pulled and the slight difference in grip, where it's a little bit of a wider grip on the row. But essentially, the pull is basically the same here. Now, what you'll start to see around now is my arms start to bend in the row. But notice they're starting to bend, but even up here, by the time the bar is getting close to my knee and at my knee, the bend is still very soft. Now, in the clean at this point, the bar is higher, and we'll talk about that in a second. But not only is the bar higher, but my arms are still straight. And that is, in fact, how we teach it, how we ideally want it to be. In the rows, my arms have bent earlier. And the bar, however, travels faster in the clean. So you see that at the point here, it's at my knee. Here, it's still an inch or two below my knee. At the point here, where the bar is hitting the jumping position at the mid-thigh in the clean, my arms are still straight versus quite bent in the row, and the bar here is just past my knee. So we see that the arms bend earlier in the row, and the bar moves faster in the clean. Now the question here is, why does the bar move faster in the clean? The simple answer, that is probably part of the reason, is in fact just because it's lighter. Now the reason I mentioned my deadlift earlier is not to brag. There are lots of people who deadlift way more than me. It's to give context for how much weight this is. Both of these are relatively light compared to my deadlift. If I just wanted to take each of these weights and pull as fast, as hard as I could on it to see how fast I can move it up, I suspect there would barely be a difference between the two because they're so far away from my maximum deadlift. There might be a very small difference, but I bet it would be almost imperceptible. I suspect, I don't know for sure, but I suspect that the primary reason for the difference between the speed, the bar speed moving so much faster in the clean, despite them both being super light relative to my deadlift, is volitional acceleration. And that is in fact the reason why we like the clean in the linear progression when it can be done. I will definitely admit that most of my clients who have gone through a linear progression have not done the clean, but ideally, if somebody is capable and willing to, I'd like them to, and this is one of the reasons. The clean produces a harder, faster volitional acceleration because you know you have to rack it. You know that you're trying to get the bar all the way up to the shoulders, and that's going to require massive amounts of acceleration. Whereas with the row, even though it's more than a deadlift, right? A deadlift, you just lock out and keep your arms straight. The row does have to move higher than the deadlift, right? A deadlift locks out somewhere around here. The row moves, what is that, you'd say about a foot, a little over a foot higher. So you do have to accelerate a row more than a deadlift. But you have to accelerate a clean, 3 feet, 2.5 feet higher, more than a deadlift, which requires a massive amount of acceleration. So I am pretty confident that the major factor, and maybe not the only factor, the weight itself is probably a little bit of a factor, but the major factor in the difference between the two and why the clean accelerates so much faster, again, at the point where the clean has just passed the knee, the barbell row, which I am volitionally accelerating more than a deadlift because I still have to pull it higher, is still 2 inches below the knee. Again, at the point where here I'm at my mid-thigh and already starting to jump, here I'm at my upper thigh, the barbell row has just passed the knee. So the clean is accelerated a lot faster, and I think at least a decent amount of that has to be down to volitional acceleration, not just the weight, because the difference in weight I don't think is great enough, and I don't think is close enough to my maximum or heavy deadlift to account for that much difference. I think there is a volitional acceleration factor here, which is why we in fact do like the clean when it can be done. There are a lot of reasons are motivation and technical why the clean might not be the best choice for everybody in the LP, and that's fair, but at least in an ideal theoretical framework, that is one of the reasons we like it. Now, so when the bar reaches the knee in the row, right about here, it is already at the double knee bend point of the clean. If we back up a couple frames, you see that at the point the bar reaches the knee in the row, my knees are already rebending here in the clean, right? Take a look at here, again, freeze frame. You see my knees have almost straightened out. They haven't locked out, but they're more or less straight. At the point where the bar here is reaching the knee, over here, you see I'm starting my double knee bend. That's something that doesn't happen in the row, right? In the row, what happens as it comes up is my arms start to bend more, right? Watch, my arms bend more. I get the shoulder extension and the elbow flexion, right? And that's what we're watching over here. The knees don't rebend. What we see is elbow flexion and shoulder extension. right, to get that bar up and touch me on the torso. Whereas if we go back through the same frames on the other side, you'll notice that the knees rebend to facilitate that second knee extension to power the bar up, essentially the jump here, right? Even though my toes don't leave the ground because it's at this point maybe too heavy for them to do so. I mean, they leave it briefly to, for the stomp to change the landing position, but I don't really jump up high into the air, probably because it's too heavy to do so, or I didn't jump hard enough, or both. But you see that knee rebend. So that's a big difference. Here, you're propelling it with the upper body, the elbow flexion and the shoulder extension, versus here you're getting that second knee bend that propels it up. And even through this, my arms are straight. Now, of course, you might say here that my arms are no longer perfectly straight. It's hard to tell whether that's because of what's happening in the lift, but even if they're not, like I said, I'm not a technical perfectioner. They're still pretty straight, and maybe they should be a little straighter. It is something that I've dealt with before. So, like I said, I'm not a model of technical perfection, but you can see a major difference between the two. Look at my arm here from this angle versus this angle. You see this one's basically straight. Even if there's a tiny bit of bend, it's basically straight, and this one is quite bent. So there's a big difference between the two there. And that changes what musculature is being worked, right? Because you're doing that elbow extension, or elbow flexion and shoulder extension, you're working the upper body much more directly. Even though you're using some of the momentum from the initial pull, you're still finishing that pull and accomplishing the top of that range of motion with a lot of upper body work, a lot of range of motion about the elbow and shoulder, right? You see here, it's fully completed. My elbows have flexed a lot, my shoulders have extended a lot. Even though I'm using the momentum, right? Play it back at full speed. See, I'm using the momentum, but I still go through a pretty good full range of motion on those upper body movements, those upper body joints, rather. Whereas in the lower body movement here, my arms don't really go through hardly any range of motion pulling directly against the weight. Again, to the extent that they are possibly bent a little tiny bit here. A, it's only a little tiny bit, and B, that's just because of my technical imperfection, not because that's what we're trying to do. To the point where the elbows actually bend, they don't actually bear the load. The bar is floating up because of the explosion that I've already done, because of the knee and hip extension and whipping through with my back, and my arms just bend to come up and catch it. They don't actually actively yank it up. It's not an upright row. So the upper body, in terms of the muscles that move the elbow and the shoulder joint, are getting a lot more direct work in the row, versus they're not so much in the clean. Now, you might make an argument that the traps get a little bit more work in the clean because of the shrug, which I didn't really talk about, but whether you do it on purpose or it just happens on its own, there's going to be a little bit of a shrug, which you can see there. You might argue that the traps get a little more work, but in general, the upper body musculature, especially the biceps, the rear delts, and the back, is going to work more in the row than the clean. In contrast, let's look at the quad, which we already looked at. So we'll look at just briefly. Because my knee here in the clean goes through that rebend and then extension, right? The initial pull is similar, but that second pull gives a lot more work to the quad. And if you look through that same part of the row, you'll notice there's not really any second knee bend. So my quads only get the little bit of work there that they get from the initial pull off the floor. There isn't a second rebend. They don't get a lot of work there. So that makes a big difference in terms of what is being worked in the two. They're both kind of full body compound movements that work the whole body. When I say the whole body, I don't mean the whole body gets worked equally and every muscle gets an equal share, but generally speaking, these are not isolated movements. These are compound movements that work, a relatively long range of motion through multiple joints and multiple large muscle groups. But there is a difference between the two, and that's just highlighting that. And the last thing I'll point out before I finish here is I have usually told my clients in the past, I've never actually measured it, I've never actually taken a super close look at it, and because I just kind of assumed I had a handle on it from doing barbell rows and watching people do barbell rows, but I never really broke it down in slow-mo before, because it's not a main lift, it's an accessory or supplemental lift, and I just don't think the differences, I've broken down the main lift in slow-mo a million times, and I just haven't done it with a barbell row because I just always kind of thought, it's not that important to do so. But of course it is, and I should have done it earlier, but I didn't. But now that I have, I've always told my clients that the barbell row is accomplished approximately the first, I often will say 3 inches, sometimes I'll say 2 to 4 inches, the same way as a deadlift, that the setup and the initial pull, the initial 3 inches of pull, or sometimes they'll say the initial 2 to 4 inches of pull are the same as the deadlift, and then you row it into your torso. Actually, watching myself do it in slow motion here, I realized that the initial pull is more than 2, probably even more than 4 inches before you significantly start doing the row. Let's go focus on the bar movement here. All right, let's take a look at that as we go through frame by frame. So I start the pull. At this point, it's still a deadlift. It's still a deadlift. It's still a deadlift. It's still a deadlift. I'm just starting to kind of activate the elbows and shoulder here, just the slightest bit. And the bar is already, what would you say, about 6 inches up, give or take, right? If it starts here kind of on the, probably about a third of the way up my shin, by the time I get to the point where I'm doing elbow flexion and shoulder extension to any serious degree, maybe about here, the bar's already just a few inches below the knee. It's already probably up about 5 or 6 inches. And before I really get into real elbow flexion and shoulder extension here, the bar's at the knee. So what I take from this is that it's actually more than 3 inches of deadlift before the row. Now, you don't have to do it this way. You could absolutely do a stricter row that either uses less momentum and maybe just does an inch or two of deadlift, or not even at all. You could do the bodybuilder style bent over row. You could do, what's probably called the pendlay row or the barbell row, where you use less momentum. Of course, you would use less weight too, but it would probably target the upper body musculature a little more specifically. And those are all valid ways to do it. There's nothing wrong with that. But in kind of the basic traditional way that I teach, as like, just here's the basic barbell row. I've always said it's like a deadlift for about 3 inches and then you row it in. What I'm seeing from here is that it's really like a deadlift for probably more like 5 or 6 inches. And even at that 5 or 6 inch mark here, you've only really just begun to row. You don't really get there in earnest with a large amount of elbow flexion and shoulder extension until the bar is at or even above the knee. And this is a relatively heavy weight, but it's not maximum for me. I imagine the heavier the weight is, the more you generate momentum with the deadlift part before you move into the row. I haven't been deadlifting that heavy coming out of the, for anybody watching this in the distant future, I'm still working my way up after not having trained for a while because of the coronavirus gym closures and stuff. I didn't have access to this garage gym until much later. So I'm still working my way up from this. So this is closer, 315 here is closer to my maximum 5 rep row than it usually would be, but it's still not there. I probably would guess I would be somewhere around, if I was doing a true 5 rep max right now, it'd probably be somewhere between 345 and 365 would be my guess. And in my normal strength level, my guess is it'd probably be more between 395 and 435, just to guess. So this is relatively heavy, but not even at the max. And even with that being the case, you see that even when the bar is at the knee, which I believe for me is about, I don't know exactly, but I want to say about a 9 or 10 inch pull at this point. I've probably pulled it about 9 or 10 inches when it's at my knee. Maybe a little more, maybe even a foot. I'm not exactly sure, but let's just say approximately 10 inches. Even then, I've still only kind of begun to bend the elbows and extend the shoulder joint. It's really not till it comes up. Let's go back, till it comes up here. So here I'm at the knee. Again, I've pulled it about 10 inches, maybe 12. I've only just begun. It's not till I get to, even the mid-thigh that it really starts in earnest to really row it hard. So I guess what I'm saying there is it's interesting. I should have looked through this in slow-mo long ago. I didn't. And what I found when doing so is, my recommendation for people, and often I'll have clients do it for the first time and say, oh, I use way too much momentum, and they pulled it for like 3 inches in a deadlift. I'm like, you hardly used any momentum at all. Well, this makes sense now. When it gets heavy, to do the barbell row this way, you're probably going to pull, as opposed to what I used to say, approximately 3 inches. It's probably more like 5 or 6, maybe even a little more before you start to really row at all. And even then, you're full kind of getting into the fuller range of motion part of the row won't happen until you are higher up. So I thought that was an interesting observation based on my own row here. Again, the heavier it is, the more that will be true. When it's light, you can do it earlier. If you're doing the stricter version of the rows, obviously you will either not use any momentum from a deadlift at all, or you will only use a little, but of course then you will use less weight. And there's trade-offs there, right? You're using less weight, but it's stricter. So there's trade-offs there. Neither is particularly right or wrong. It really kind of depends on the purpose for which you're doing it. This is the version I like. I do chin-ups and lat pull-downs anyway. Sometimes I even do dumbbell rows, so I get a decent amount of kind of upper body focused elbow extension or elbow flexion and shoulder extension, that kind of movement anyway. Mostly in the vertical, but a little bit in the horizontal plane. So I like to use these as like a total body thing that also gets some upper body. But if you want to do a stricter version with less weight, certainly has validity to it. But for kind of the basic version that I like to do, and that at least when I first start people on it, I often will have it be almost a practice for their deadlift setup. So I have them set up the same way as a deadlift, as opposed to introducing a whole new style of setup and pull to somebody who's still fairly new to training. I like this to reinforce the deadlift that they're still getting good at. So this is the way I teach it to people early on. And once they get more advanced, once they get into broader training, we can branch out if we want to. There, you don't have to. I usually don't do the other kind of row. I do dumbbell rows, I do chin-ups and lat pull-downs, but when I do rows, I usually still just do them this way because I prefer to do it that way. But you can branch off later on. I like to use this version as the way I teach it because it reinforces the deadlift setup and initial pull, which for people who are first learning to barbell row, they're probably still even then learning to master the deadlift setup and pull too. So this just reinforces that by having them take an identical stance and initiation of the pull. So that's what I got. Hopefully this was interesting, maybe even a little useful. I think I learned something from it. So hopefully some of y'all did too. So I'd love to hear feedback in the comments, and that's it for now.